Good evening and welcome back. What if one of the smallest, most ordinary objects on your dinner table tonight, the little metal thing you barely notice, resting quietly beside your plate, was once believed to be an insult to God himself, a tool of vanity and pride so offensive to the natural order that a holy man declared a princess struck dead by divine punishment for daring to lift her food with it? Tonight, we're going to follow that little object across almost 1,000 years, from the marble halls of Constantinople to the greasy trestle tables of medieval Europe, from the courts of kings to the kitchens of ordinary people, and we are going to discover why something so gentle, so useful, so completely harmless, took the better part of 8 centuries to become welcome at the tables of the Western world. If you enjoy these slow walks through the quiet corners of history, you might take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and only if it feels right. And if you're listening from somewhere special tonight, from a city with a long memory, or a small room far from anywhere, I'd love it if you left your location and your local time down in the comments, so we can all feel a little less alone in the dark. Now, dim the lights, settle into whatever holds you best. Perhaps turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, back to a world where the fork did not yet exist, and no one felt its absence at all. Let us begin then, in a great hall in Europe, somewhere around the year 1100, in the long deep middle of the age we now call medieval. The hour is early evening and the light is failing outside the narrow windows, so that most of the warmth in the room comes from a great open hearth at one end, where whole logs are burning down to a bed of red coals, and the smoke rises up through the high timbered roof and drifts out through a hole cut in the peak, staining the beams above with a soft black soot that has been gathering there for generations. The floor is not wood but packed earth, strewn over with rushes and dried herbs, sweet flag, meadow sweet, a little lavender, so that when boots and slippers crush them underfoot, they release a green, grassy scent that mingles with the wood smoke and the roasting meat. Down the length of the hall run long trestle tables, boards laid across supports that can be taken down and stacked against the wall when the meal is done. For the hall is not only a dining room but a council chamber, a courtroom, and sometimes a bedchamber for the lower servants who sleep near the dying fire. On the tables lie coarse white cloths, and on the cloths, the food. And here is the thing that would strike you most if you could stand quietly in the doorway of that hall and watch. There are no forks. There is not a single fork in the entire room, nor in the kitchen behind it, nor in the whole of the great house, nor in the town beyond, nor in the kingdom, nor, so far as almost anyone in that hall would ever know, anywhere in the whole of the Christian West. And yet nothing is missing. The meal proceeds with grace and order and a kind of easy ceremony that has been refined over centuries. The lords and the bishops and the knights, the great ladies in their long gowns, the clerks and the household officers, all of them are eating with their hands, and they are doing it, we must understand, not as savages, not as people who have forgotten some better way, but as the heirs of an ancient and elaborate art. To eat with the hands in this world is not the absence of manners, it is the whole system of manners, it is civilization itself. Picture the food as it comes in, borne on great platters by serving men who carry them shoulder high through the smoke. There are whole roasted birds, capons and geese, and, on a feast day such as this, perhaps a swan or a peacock, its skin and feathers stripped away for the cooking and then carefully replaced afterward so that it seems to sail down the hall still robed in its own plumage. There are joints of beef and haunches of venison, glistening and dark, and sides of pork with the crackling gone to amber. There are pies with pastry crusts thick as a fist, more container than food, built to be broken open at the table. There are sauces sharp with vinegar and spice, green sauces of parsley and mint, yellow sauces stained with the costly threads of saffron, and the whole air is heavy with the smell of them, with pepper and ginger and cloves brought at great expense from lands the diners will never see. And beside each person at the high table, or shared between two who are close in rank, lies a slab of bread. It is not the bread you would want to eat. It is a trencher, a thick, flat, squared-off piece cut from a coarse loaf that has been baked days before and left to go stale and firm, so that it will hold its shape and soak up the juices without falling apart. This trencher is the plate, There is no other. The food is laid upon it, or beside it, and it drinks up the sauces and the blood of the meat, and by the end of the meal it is soaked through and dark and rich, and it is not thrown away. It is gathered up with the leavings and given, in the finest households, to the poor who wait at the gate, or to the dogs that lie beneath the tables waiting for exactly this, or scattered for the birds. Nothing here is wasted, and the sodden bread that has served as a plate becomes, in its turn, an act of charity or a scrap for a hungry animal. Now watch the hands themselves, for this is where the art truly lives. A knight reaches toward the roasted capon. He does not simply grab at it. There is a rule, understood by everyone in that hall as deeply as they understand their prayers, and it is a rule that governs the very fingers he may use. The food is taken up with the thumb, the index finger, and the middle finger. 3 fingers only, working delicately together. The last 2 fingers of the hand curled away and kept clean, held slightly apart from the messy work so that they remain unstained and ready. This is the 3-finger rule, and it was taught to children of good family from the time they were old enough to sit at table, drilled into them alongside the proper way to bow and the proper way to address a lord. To reach into the common dish with the whole fist, to plunge in all 5 fingers grasping like a peasant snatching at scraps, would mark a person instantly as low-born, ill-raised, without breeding. The 3 fingers, moving with restraint, taking only a modest portion, never lunging, never seizing. This was elegance. This was the mark of someone who belonged. And there was more than just the choosing of fingers. There was the whole delicate question of cleanliness, which mattered enormously in a world where dishes were shared, where several diners might reach into the same great bowl of stew or the same platter of meat, dipping their fingers again and again into food that others would eat. To touch the shared dish with fingers that were greasy or soiled from your own mouth was among the gravest offences a person could commit at table, for it was not merely rude to yourself but a violation against everyone else eating from the same vessel. And so, cleanliness was not an afterthought, but the very heart of the etiquette. A 13th century poem of manners known as the Urbanus Magnus, a guide to courtly and refined behaviour, made this absolutely plain. The diner was expected to wipe the fingers clean before reaching again into the common food. There were cloths for exactly this purpose. Sometimes a long linen napkin lay across the table for shared use. In the finest houses, each honoured guest might have a cloth of their own, and there were servants whose task it was, between courses, to carry basins of scented water and towels from guest to guest, so that hands might be rinsed and dried before and during and after the meal. Rose water, sometimes, or water steeped with herbs, poured over the fingers into a wide silver bowl. To be seen wiping your greasy hands carelessly on your own tunic, or worse on the tablecloth, or worst of all licking your fingers clean before dipping them back into the shared dish. These were the sins of the untutored. The refined diner wiped and rinsed and kept those 2 curled fingers clean, and reached with only the 3, and in doing so participated in a shared and unspoken language of grace that everyone at the table could read at a glance. So you see, the fork is not missing from this hall. It is not a hole waiting to be filled, not a problem waiting for a solution, not a discomfort that anyone feels. The hand is the tool, and it is a good tool, and it is governed by an entire architecture of etiquette, every bit as complex and every bit as capable of marking the well-bred from the ill-bred as any later system of knives and spoons and forks would ever be. For all of recorded Western history up to this moment, through the Greeks and the Romans, through the long centuries of the early church, through the reigns of emperors and the rise and fall of kingdoms, the fingers were how one ate. The Romans reclined on their couches and took their food with their hands, guided by their own careful codes. The barbarian kings who came after them ate with their hands. The monks in their refectories ate with their hands in silence, listening to scripture read aloud. There were knives? Yes. Every person of any standing carried a small personal knife, worn at the belt, used to cut meat from the bone, and to spear a piece and carry it toward the trencher, and often shared between 2 diners, for it was as much a general tool as a dining implement. And there were spoons, made of wood or horn, or, for the wealthy, of silver, used for the soups and the potages and the soft things that could not be managed by the fingers alone. But of the fork, as a personal implement for lifting solid food to the mouth, there was nothing. It simply did not exist in that world, and no one thought to want it, because the hand, trained and disciplined and clean, did everything a diner needed and did it with an ease that 1,000 years of practice had made to seem entirely natural. This is the world we must hold in our minds, gently and clearly, before the strange object arrives. A world where eating with the hands was not crude but courtly, not a lack but a craft. Because only when we truly understand that the fork was not filling any need, only when we grasp that Western Europe was entirely content, entirely civilized, entirely at peace with its own hands, can we begin to understand the shock, the strangeness, and the moral fury that greeted the fork when at last it came. And it did not come as an invention, born in some clever European workshop to solve a problem. It came as an import. It came as a foreign thing, carried west by a foreign bride, from a city that the people of the Latin West both admired and distrusted, a city that was to them the very image of wealth and refinement, and at the same time of dangerous, unmanly, overripe luxury. It came from Constantinople, for far away to the east, on the shores where Europe reaches toward Asia, there stood the greatest and most splendid Christian city in the world, the capital of what we now call the Byzantine Empire, the surviving eastern half of the old Roman Empire, which had never fallen, which had gone on for centuries after Rome itself was sacked, carrying the old imperial traditions forward in unbroken splendour. Constantinople in these years was a city of a scale and a richness that the muddy towns of the West could scarcely imagine. It had walls so vast that no enemy had breached them in 700 years. It had domed churches sheathed in gold mosaic, whose interiors glowed like the inside of a jewel. It had markets heaped with silk from China and spices from India, with ivory and pearls and enamels worked so fine they seemed to have been made by no human hand. It had running water and public baths and a court so hedged about with ceremony that a visitor might stand in the throne room and watch mechanical golden lions roar and mechanical golden birds sing from the branches of a golden tree. And in this city, among the great families and at the imperial table, the people had long since adopted a small and elegant tool for eating. They called it, in the Latin the Westerners would use for it, the fursilla, a little fork, a small two-tined instrument usually of gold or silver among the elite, used to spear a delicate morsel and carry it to the lips without ever soiling the fingers. To the Byzantines this was nothing remarkable at all. It was simply how a refined person ate. It had been so among the elite for a very long time, and so we come to a wedding. In the year 1004, a marriage was arranged that would bind together for a moment these two very different worlds. In Constantinople there lived a young noblewoman named Maria Argyropoulina, a princess of the great Byzantine court, and, most importantly for the story, a niece of the reigning emperor himself, Basil II, one of the most powerful monarchs on earth. To be connected to Maria was to be connected to the very summit of the imperial world, and far to the west, in the young and ambitious maritime republic of Venice, there ruled a doge named Pietro II Orseolo, a shrewd and rising leader whose city was beginning to spread its trading power across the seas. The doge had a son, Giovanni Orseolo, and it was arranged that Giovanni would marry Mircea, the emperor's niece, a match that would raise the standing of Venice enormously, binding this ambitious Italian republic to the ancient glory of the Byzantine throne. The wedding was celebrated in Constantinople with all the imperial pageantry the great city could muster, and then, in time, the young bride was carried west across the sea to her new home, to Venice, to a world she must have found smaller, rougher, colder, and stranger than anything she had ever known. Imagine her arrival. Imagine Maria, raised amid gold mosaics and silk and the endless soft ceremony of the most sophisticated court in Christendom, sitting down at last to dine among her Venetian hosts. And imagine what she saw. The Venetians of that day, for all their growing wealth, ate as all Westerners ate, with their hands taking up their food with their fingers, however carefully and however cleanly, dipping into the shared dishes, tearing at the meat. To Maria this must have seemed astonishing, perhaps even a little barbarous, the way the customs of a distant place can seem to a newcomer who has never known any other way. And so, at the banquet, she did what she had always done, what every refined person she had ever known had always done. She did not touch her food with her fingers. Instead, and here the chronicler is very precise, she had her food cut up beforehand into small pieces by the servants who attended her, and then she took a small golden instrument with two prongs, her fursilla, her little fork, and with it she speared each dainty morsel in turn and carried it delicately to her lips, never letting her fingers touch the food at all. To Maria it was grace itself. To her Venetian hosts it was something else entirely. It was strange. It was foreign. It was to their eyes a display of vanity almost beyond understanding. This Eastern princess who would not eat as everyone ate, who found their honest hands beneath her, who required a special golden tool and servants to prepare her food, and this whole precious performance simply to lift a piece of meat to her mouth. The word that clung to it in the Western imagination was luxury, and behind that word lurked others: softness, decadence, an unmanly over-refinement, the sense that here was a way of living so pampered and so artificial that it had lost touch with plain and honest nature. And it was into this atmosphere of suspicion and quiet scandal that there stepped a man whose words would echo down the centuries and whose judgment would follow the little fork like a shadow for hundreds of years to come. His name was Peter Damian. He was a Benedictine monk, born around the year 1007, a man of fierce intelligence and fiercer conviction, a reformer of the church who spent his life railing against corruption and softness and worldly excess wherever he found it. He would in time become a cardinal, and long after his death a saint, and his writings were widely read and deeply respected. Peter Damian was not a man who valued comfort. He was drawn to the hardest and most austere forms of monastic life, to fasting and self-denial and the mortification of the flesh, and he saw in the growing wealth and softness of the world around him a grave spiritual danger. To such a man, the story of the Byzantine princess and her golden fork was almost too perfect an illustration of everything he feared and despised. And so he wrote of her, and what he wrote was merciless. He described her exactly and with disgust. She would not, he wrote, deign to touch her food with her fingers, as ordinary honest people did. Instead, she had her eunuchs, her servants, cut her food into small pieces, which she would then impale upon a certain golden instrument with 2 prongs, and thus carry it to her mouth. And this, to Peter Damian, was not elegance. It was pride. It was vanity of the deepest and most sinful kind. For behind his revulsion lay a whole way of understanding the world, a theology of the body and of nature and of God's design. The human hand, Peter Damian believed, and many believed with him, was given to us by the Creator himself. God, in his wisdom, had fashioned the fingers precisely so that we might use them, to work, to pray, and yes, to eat. The fingers were, in a phrase that would follow the fork for centuries, our natural forks, given by God for exactly this purpose, and to reject them, to set them aside as beneath you, to interpose between yourself and your food an artificial instrument of cold-worked metal. This was not merely strange or foreign or vain. It was an act of arrogance against God himself. It was to look upon the design of the Creator and to find it insufficient, to say that what the Almighty had provided was not good enough, that one required something finer, something of one's own invention. It was the sin of pride wearing the mask of good manners. And then came the ending that sealed the story in the Western mind and gave it the terrible force of a warning. For Maria Argyropulina did not live long in her new home. Not long after her arrival in Venice, the sources tell us it was in the year 1006 or perhaps 1007, she was struck down by plague and died, young and far from the golden city of her birth. It was, in that age, a common enough fate. Disease took the high and the low alike, the pious and the proud, and there was nothing in her death that a modern eye would find remarkable. But Peter Damian did not see it that way, and neither did the clerical critics who followed him. To them the meaning was unmistakable. This woman's vanity, Peter Damian wrote, had been hateful to Almighty God, and so, plainly and without doubt, God had taken his revenge. Her early death was not misfortune, it was judgment. It was the direct and visible hand of the Creator, striking down the proud foreigner who had scorned the fingers he had given her and reached instead for her little golden tool. Her rotting body, some would later add with grim satisfaction, was the fitting end of such decadence. The message could not have been clearer, and it would be repeated and remembered for a very long time. To use the fork was to invite the wrath of heaven. And this is the strange and heavy thing that we must sit with tonight, as the fire in that imagined hall burns low and the shared dishes are carried away. Here was an object of pure practicality, a small, clean, useful tool that had served the most sophisticated society in the Christian world for generations without the slightest hint of scandal. In Constantinople it was nothing. In Venice, in the Latin West, it became at once a symbol of moral transgression, an emblem of pride and softness and foreign corruption, a thing that clergymen would compare in the centuries to come to the very pitchfork of the devil. The fork had arrived in Europe not as a convenience but as a temptation, not as a gift but as a warning, and it carried upon it from that very first golden banquet a curse spoken by a saint. It would not be easily forgiven. The theological framework that Peter Damian had raised around it, the idea that to master a natural act with an artificial instrument was a kind of arrogance, a corruption of the God-given order of the body, would prove astonishingly durable, far more durable than the princess herself, far more durable than the little golden fork that was buried or melted down and forgotten. That idea would linger in the air of Europe quietly and stubbornly, shaping the way people looked at the fork for hundreds of years, long after anyone remembered exactly why. And the little tool that seemed to solve no problem at all, that answered a need nobody felt, would have to wait and wait and wait through the long silence of the centuries before the West was ready to take it up. And so the silence settled in, the way winter settles over a quiet field, without a single sudden movement, without any announcement at all. The fork, which had blazed for one bright and scandalous evening at a Venetian wedding feast, simply faded from view. It did not vanish in a moment. There was no edict, no burning, no great ceremony of banishment. It slipped away gradually, as most things do in this long story, until one day it was simply gone from the record, and no one thought to note its absence. For roughly 300 years after Maria Argyropoulina reached for her little golden instrument and drew the wrath of a saint down upon her, the fork all but disappears from the written and painted memory of Western Europe. When we go looking for it in the surviving documents of those centuries, we find almost nothing at all. Consider what that means, and how strange it is. Across 3 long centuries, the men and women of medieval Europe made lists of nearly everything they owned. They were, in their way, careful keepers of accounts. When a lord died, his goods were inventoried by careful hands. The number of his silver cups, the weight of his gold plate, the count of his knives and his spoons, the linens folded in his chests, the beasts standing in his fields. Monasteries recorded the contents of their kitchens and their treasuries. Merchants tallied their wares down to the smallest coin. Wills and dowries and marriage contracts named the smallest household objects, passing a favourite spoon from mother to daughter, listing a set of knives among the treasures of an estate. And through all of these careful lists, across all of these centuries, the fork is very nearly absent. It is not counted among the silver. It is not passed down in the wills. It is not named in the dowries. Where the knife and the spoon appear again and again, reliable and unremarkable, the fork is simply not there. Nor do we find it in the art of those years, and this too is telling. The manuscript painters of medieval Europe loved to show the table. They painted feasts and banquets in the bright margins of their books, painted the Last Supper and the wedding at Cana, and the everyday meals of kings and saints, painted the loaves and the fishes and the roasted fowl, painted the knives resting on the cloth and the fingers reaching toward the shared dish. They painted the world of the table in loving and patient detail, and in all of that abundance of painted eating the fork does not appear. The hand reaches for the food, the knife cuts, the spoon lifts the broth, but the little 2-pronged tool that Maria had used is nowhere to be seen, not on the tables of kings, not in the margins of prayer books, not in the illuminated feasts that decorated the great works of the age, and the cookery texts are silent as well. Those who wrote down the recipes of the medieval kitchen, who set out how to roast and boil and season and serve, who described the carving of meats and the arrangement of dishes and the proper order of a great meal, they never once instruct the diner to take up a fork. They speak of the knife for cutting, and the spoon for supping, and the fingers for the rest. The fork has no place in their world at all. It is as though the object had never existed, as though that one golden evening in Venice had been a strange dream, a rumour, a thing half remembered and then let go. Now, we should be careful here, for a silence in the record is not quite the same thing as a silence in the world. When historians look at this long gap, They do not conclude that every fork in Europe was gathered up and destroyed, that the object was hunted to extinction and wiped from the face of the continent. Objects are stubborn things, and they persist in quiet corners even when no one writes them down. It is entirely possible that here and there, in this kitchen or that, a small fork lingered, a tool for lifting hot things from the fire, for pulling meat from a pot, for some narrow practical task in the back rooms where no chronicler ever looked. The silence of the record does not prove the silence of the world. But it tells us something perhaps even more interesting than absence. It tells us what the people of that age chose not to see, chose not to name, chose not to preserve. For a society writes down what it values and what it wishes to remember. It records the objects that carry status, the things that a person might be proud to own and to pass along. And it quietly omits what it finds shameful, or unimportant, or embarrassing to acknowledge. The fork, in the centuries after Maria's disgrace, seems to have fallen into that second category, too marginal to matter or too tainted to mention. It had been branded as a foreign vanity, a mark of softness and pride, a thing that had drawn down the judgment of heaven upon a proud princess. Who would list such an object among their treasures? Who would want it painted at their table, or named in their will, or set down in the pages of their cookery book? To possess it openly was to associate oneself with everything Peter Damien had condemned. And so, whether or not the fork survived here and there in the shadows, it survived without a name, without a portrait, without a place in the official memory of the age. This is the first great lesson that the fork's long journey teaches us, that the history we inherit is not simply the record of what happened, but the record of what a society was willing to admit had happened. There are objects and practices and whole ways of living that slip through the gaps in the record, not because they were rare, but because they were unwelcome, not because they were forgotten, but because they were, in a sense, refused. The story of the fork in these 3 silent centuries is a story told by an absence, and the absence itself speaks. It says, this thing was not wanted here. It says, this thing carried a stain that made people wish to look away. And so, we must read the silence the way we read the pages, patiently and with attention to what is not being said. And through all of those silent years, the river of ordinary life kept flowing, indifferent to the fate of one small object. The great cycle of the medieval year turned as it always had, the ploughing and the sowing, the growing green of spring, the ripening of the grain, the harvest and the threshing, the slaughter of the autumn beasts and the salting of the meat against the winter. In the fields the peasants ate as they had always eaten, with fingers and bread and a wooden spoon for the pottage in the common pot. In the great halls the lords and their households gathered at the shared table, dipped into the shared dishes, cut with their knives and lifted with their 3 clean fingers, and thought nothing of it, because there was nothing to think. The absence of the fork was not a hardship. No one missed it. No one felt its lack. Life at the table went on, warm and communal and complete, and the little tool that had caused such a stir in Venice lay forgotten in the dark, waiting for a world that was in no hurry to arrive. But nothing in this story ever happened suddenly, and the silence did not end with a thunderclap either. It ended the way these things always end, gradually, quietly, in a narrow and cautious lane, in a place that had never quite let the object go. For if there was any corner of Europe where the fork might survive its long disgrace, it was the corner that had first received it, the trading cities of Italy, looking always eastward across the sea toward Constantinople and the older, richer world of Byzantium. Venice, Florence, Siena. These were places where the goods of the East arrived in the holds of merchant ships, where the spices and the silks and the sugar of distant lands passed through busy hands, where wealth was measured not only in land but in the fine and precious objects of trade. And it was here, slowly, cautiously, in the 13th and early 14th centuries, that the fork began once more to appear in the written record, but appear in a very particular way, in a very particular disguise, wearing a mask that let it slip past the old condemnation unnoticed. For when the fork returns to the inventories of these Italian merchant houses, it does not return as a tool for eating. It returns as something smaller and more specialized, something that could not possibly threaten the sacred act of the meal. In the careful lists of the wealthy trading families, small 2-pronged forks of silver begin to appear alongside the knives and the spoons. but they are never counted among the general implements of the table. They are set apart, categorized under their own quiet heading, grouped not with the tools of eating but with the objects of luxury and refinement. They are listed as sweetmeat tools. They are named as implements for confections, and in that small distinction lay all the difference in the world. For here was the loophole, the clever and quiet path around the theological wall that Peter Damian had raised. The Church had condemned the fork as an insult to God's design, an artificial thing thrust between the diner and the food that the Creator had given fingers to touch. But that condemnation was aimed at the meal, at the eating of bread and meat and the honest sustenance of the body, the natural act that natural fingers were made to perform. It was never framed as a rule about sugar, and so the Italian merchant class, with the practical shrewdness of people who traded for a living, found a way to keep the useful little object without inviting the wrath of heaven. They simply confined it to the very narrowest of tasks. The fork would not touch the meat, it would not touch the bread, it would not intrude upon the shared dishes of the ordinary meal at all. It would touch only the delicacies, the candied fruits, the preserved ginger, the sticky sweetmeats, and the precious confections that came at the end of a fine feast, the small luxuries that were themselves a mark of wealth and refinement. And this made a certain practical sense, quite apart from theology. For these were the foods that fingers handled badly. A candied fruit dripping in syrup, a piece of preserved ginger glistening and sticky, a sugared delicacy that would stain the fingers and mark the fine linen cuffs of a wealthy man. These were exactly the things that the 3 clean fingers of the medieval rule could not manage gracefully. To reach into a dish of sticky sweetmeats with a bare hand was to leave the table with fingers coated and gleaming, to soil the cloth, to smear the cup, to undo all the careful cleanliness that good manners demanded. The little fork solved this small and specific problem beautifully. It let a person take up a sticky, precious morsel without staining a single finger. It kept the hands clean for the objects of luxury, and because it touched only luxury, only sweetness, only the refined trifles of the wealthy, it carried none of the moral weight of the meal itself. It was a tool for the delicate, not the gluttonous. It touched sugar, and sugar was not bread, and so the old curse could not quite reach it. We are fortunate in following this quiet return to have one record that lets us see it plainly and in detail, the vast archive of a single remarkable merchant. His name was Francesco di Marco da Tini, and he lived from around the year 1335 to the year 1410. He is remembered by history as the merchant of Prato, a man of that busy Tuscan town who built a great fortune in trade and, more importantly for our story, kept everything. He kept his account books and his letters and his inventories with a thoroughness that borders on the astonishing, and when his archive was rediscovered in the year 1870, centuries after his death, it opened a window onto the material world of the late medieval Italian merchant class more complete than almost any other. In the ledgers and the lists that begin in the year 1361, we can see the goods that passed through Dattini's hands and the objects that furnished his household, set down in patient columns by the hands of his clerks, and there, among those careful records, the fork appears. But note where it appears, and note the company it keeps. It is not listed with the plate of the table, not counted among the vessels of the meal. It is listed among the spices and the sugar and the delicacies, among the precious, costly foods of the East that Dattini's kind of merchant traded in and prized. It sits in the inventory beside the candied things and the sweet things, the very foods it was meant to handle. It is a tool of the confection, a tool of the delicacy, filed away in the category of luxury rather than sustenance, and in that quiet placement we can read the whole strategy of the Italian merchant class laid out before us. Keep the fork, use the fork, treasure the fork even, but keep it in its narrow lane, keep it far from the honest meat and bread that the theologians guarded, keep it touching only the sweet and the precious, and it will cause no scandal at all. And so, without any grand declaration, without any challenge to the church, without anyone announcing that the old curse had been lifted, the fork was quietly domesticated in the households of wealthy Italy. It did not force its way back into the meal. It slipped in through the side door, through the dish of sweetmeats at the end of the feast, and there it made itself at home. For centuries it would live in this restricted, socially acceptable form, an elegant little tool for the refined, a mark of the household wealthy enough to serve sugared delicacies and cultured enough to eat them without staining a finger. It touched sugar and not meat, and by touching only sugar it survived. The West was still not ready to eat with it. But in the trading cities of Italy, in the quiet company of the confections, the fork had found a way to endure, and it would wait there, patiently, in the pantries of the wealthy, for the long centuries it would take before it could rise again to the table proper. But to understand why the West resisted the fork so long and so stubbornly, why the little object had to hide among the sweetmeats rather than take its natural place beside the knife and the spoon, we must step back for a moment from the record itself and think more deeply about what the medieval meal really was and why the fork threatened it. For the objection to the fork was never only a matter of theology, never only the argument of Peter Damian about fingers and the design of God. Beneath that religious language lay something older and deeper, something woven into the very fabric of how medieval society held itself together. And here the thinking of one modern scholar can help us see it clearly. In the year 1939, a sociologist named Norbert Elias published a great and patient work that he called The Civilizing Process, and in it he set out to understand how the manners of Europe had slowly changed across the centuries, how the way people ate and washed and carried their bodies had shifted, and what those shifts revealed about the way society itself was arranged. When Elias looked back at the medieval table, he did not see disorder or crudeness, as an unkind eye might. He saw something coherent and meaningful. He saw a way of eating that expressed the deepest values of the world that produced it. For the medieval hall, as Elias understood it, was built upon a foundation of communal interdependence, a web of bonds and obligations that tied people together, lord to knight, master to household, one body to another. And the table was where that web made itself visible. Dining was not a private act, performed behind a wall of restraint. It was a public performance, a shared and open thing, in which the closeness of bodies and the mingling of hands were not embarrassments to be overcome but signs of belonging and of honour. Diners ate from common vessels, they reached into the same dishes, they tore bread from the same loaf and dipped into the same pot, and took their portions from the thick slices of bread that served as shared plates. And the touching of the same food by many hands was not a thing of disgust. It was a thing of trust. It was a thing of bond. Think of what it meant in such a world, for a lord to share food from his own trencher with a knight he favoured, to reach into his own portion and offer a choice piece across the table to a man he wished to honour. That gesture was not carelessness. It was ceremony. It was a public declaration of favour, a bond made visible through the sharing of food, an act of intimacy and honour that everyone at the table could see and understand. The proximity, the shared touch, the willingness to eat close and to eat together from common dishes, these were the very language of medieval status and loyalty. To dine together in this way was to affirm the ties that held the whole social order in place. And into this world, the fork brought a quiet and profound threat. For the fork, as Elias saw with great clarity, did something more than provide a clean way to lift a piece of food. It placed a barrier between the person and the meal. It allowed a diner to take food without touching it, to reach into the shared dish, not with the warm and familiar hand, but with a cold and private instrument of metal. Elias described this as the raising of an invisible wall, a wall of feeling, of restraint, of a growing sense of shame about the closeness of bodies and the mingling of hands. The fork individualized the act of eating. It drew a line around the single diner. It replaced the communal intimacy of the shared touch with a new and private carefulness, a keeping of oneself apart, a reluctance to let one's own hand mingle with the common food and the common dish. And this, Elias argued, was why the fork met such deep and lasting resistance, a resistance that ran far below the level of the theologians' arguments, down into the very structure of society itself. The problem with the fork was not only that it insulted the design of God, as Peter Damian had thundered. The problem was that it insulted the design of the medieval world, the whole architecture of hierarchy and bond and honour that was expressed meal after meal through the shared and open touching of food. To take up the fork was to withdraw from that web. It was to say, in the quiet language of the body, that one preferred one's own carefulness to the communal intimacy of the hall, that one wished to place a wall between oneself and the shared dish, that the closeness which had always meant honour now felt somehow like something to be avoided. And a society built upon that closeness could not easily welcome an object whose very purpose was to hold it at a distance. So we can see now that the fork faced not one enemy, but two, standing together and reinforcing one another. There was the theological objection, spoken aloud by saints and clergymen, that to master a natural act with an artificial tool was a sin of pride against the Creator. And beneath it, unspoken but far stronger, there was the sociological objection that the fork threatened the shared table, the communal touch, the very way that medieval people understood their bonds to one another. The two worked together, the loud argument and the silent one, and between them they held the fork at bay for centuries. This is why the record fell silent. This is why the little object had to hide among the sweetmeats, touching only sugar, keeping far from the honest meal. It was not merely condemned by heaven. It was quietly refused by the whole shape of the world it had entered. And yet, as Elias understood, that shape was not fixed forever. Societies change, slowly and without sudden breaks, and the wall of feeling that the fork represented would one day become not a threat but a value. The individualization of the body, the private restraint, the keeping of a delicate distance would in time be renamed as refinement, as civility, as good manners themselves. But that change lay far ahead, across many quiet centuries, and it would come as everything in this story comes, gradually and without upheaval. For now, in the great halls and the busy trading cities, the old world held. The lords still shared from their trenchers, the hands still met over the common dish, and the fork waited in its narrow lane among the confections, an unwelcome guest in the medieval imagination, biding its time in the pantries of Italy, while the shared table of Europe went on as it always had, warm and close and complete, in no hurry at all to let the little instrument in. And so the years went on turning, one into the next, in the slow and patient way that centuries have of turning, and the fork remained where it had been placed, set apart, half hidden, permitted to touch only the sugared things and never the honest meal. But the world that held it at a distance was itself beginning, very gradually, to change. Trade widened, books multiplied. The old halls with their shared trenchers began, in the wealthiest houses, to give way to grander and more ceremonious ways of dining, and the great families of Italy, the same families whose merchants had first tucked the little instrument among their spices and their candied fruits, began to marry outward, sending their daughters across the mountains into the courts of France and beyond. And when a daughter of such a family travelled, she did not travel lightly. She travelled with her linens and her jewels, her plate and her cloth of gold, her cooks and her confectioners, and all the small accustomed comforts of a life lived among the refinements of the Italian cities. And so it was that the fork, which had crept so quietly back into the Western world by hiding among the sweetmeats, at last found its way across a border it had not crossed in living memory, carried not by a merchant this time, but by a bride. The bride was Catherine de' Medici, and the year was 1533. She was 14 years old when she left Florence, a young woman of one of the most powerful and cultivated families in all of Europe, and she was travelling to Marseille to be married to the man who would one day become Henri II, King of France. It is a long way from Florence to the coast of France, and she made the journey with an entourage befitting her name, the Medici name, which carried with it the weight of banking fortunes, of patronage, of popes, of a civilization that considered itself the most refined on earth. And among the many things she is said to have brought with her, packed away in her trousseau among the silks and the silver, were her own personal forks. Small ones, of the Italian kind, of the sort that had by now become quite ordinary at the better tables of Florence and Venice and Siena, where the sweetmeat tool had slowly, quietly begun to widen its permissions. She'd grown up with them. She thought nothing of them, and she brought them with her into a court that had never seen anything quite like them used at table. Now, we must tread carefully here, because this is a story that has been told and retold so many times that it has taken on the smooth and polished shape of legend, and the historians who have looked closely at it are cautious about how much of it can truly be proven. The tale that Catherine de' Medici single-handedly introduced the fork to France, that she carried it over the mountains as a novelty entirely unknown to the French, is almost certainly too simple. Scholars note that the fork was already faintly present in some French aristocratic circles before she ever arrived, that it had begun to appear, here and there, in the households of the very grand, perhaps even under her husband's father, King Francis Lorenzo, whose court had already drunk deeply of Italian art and Italian fashion. So Catherine's role, the careful scholars tell us, was very likely not one of pure invention, but of validation and acceleration, a matter of taking something that was nascent and faint and lending it the enormous prestige of the Medici name, of making it visible, of making it something a French courtier might notice and remark upon and mock. And it is that mockery, more than the plain fact of the fork's arrival, that makes this moment worth pausing over. For whether or not Catherine truly brought the first fork into France, the legend that grew up around her tells us something true about how Europeans would come to understand the whole story of the fork's slow spread. As a thing that came from Italy, that came with the Italians, that arrived as a foreign affectation and had to be argued and mocked and grudgingly absorbed before it could ever be called French, because the French court did not welcome the little instrument with open arms. Far from it. The courtiers of France were accustomed to eating with knives and with fingers, in the honest and robust manner they considered entirely natural and entirely sufficient, and they looked upon the fork with the same suspicion that the Venetians had shown to Maria Argyropoulina 500 years before. It was an Italian affectation, they said, a fussy, over-delicate, unnecessary thing, a tool for people who thought too well of themselves and too little of the good plain ways of their ancestors. To eat with one's fingers was manly, it was direct, it was French, and to fumble at one's food with a little pronged instrument of silver, holding oneself apart from the meal as though the touch of it were somehow beneath one, seemed to the French nobility not refined at all but ridiculous, a symbol of a soft and effeminate foreignness that had no business at a good French table. The old suspicion of the fork, the same suspicion that had once been spoken in the language of sin, now returned in the language of national character, Italian delicacy set against French heartiness, southern fussiness against northern strength. It was the same wall of feeling that Elias had described, only now it wore the colours of a country's pride. And the satirists of the age had a fine time with all of it. The young queen and her Italian ways became a subject of jokes and lampoons, and one of the favourite images they seized upon was the sheer clumsiness of anyone trying to eat with a fork for the first time. For it is a genuinely awkward thing, learning to use a fork if you have never done it, the balancing of the food upon the little tines, the careful lifting of it up through the air, the long and perilous journey from the plate to the mouth, with so many chances along the way for the morsel to slip and tumble and fall. The satirists noted with great delight that the fashionable diners who took up the new tool spent as much time chasing their food as eating it, that half of what they lifted fell away before it ever reached their lips, dropping down the front of a fine gown or scattering across a costly tablecloth. There is something almost tender in the picture. A court of the proudest people in Europe, dressed in their silks and their jewels, fumbling and dropping and spilling as they wrestled with a small silver object that a Florentine child would have handled without a thought. The fork made fools of them, and they resented it, and their resentment made its way into verse and jest and caricature, so that the young Italian queen who had brought this fussy foreign thing into their midst became, for a time, a figure of gentle ridicule. But we should not imagine that this ridicule was a small or passing thing, some minor discomfort of court fashion. It marked in truth something new in our story, the fork's first real encounter with a great court that was not Italian, and with it, the surfacing of a whole new dimension of the object's meaning. For up to now, the fork had been a matter of theology and of society, a sin against God, a withdrawal from the communal table. But now, on the borders between one people and another, it became something else as well. It became a marker of identity, a little silver flag planted in the ongoing argument between nations about who was refined and who was coarse, who was civilized and who was strong, who was too delicate and who was too rude. The Italians, who had learned to use it, regarded it as a mark of their superior cultivation. The French, who had not, regarded it as a mark of Italian softness. And so the fork, which had begun its Western life as a scandal of pride and had spent centuries as a scandal of privacy, now took up a third career as a scandal of foreignness, a thing that told you, the moment it appeared upon a table, whose customs a household admired and whose it despised. This is a burden the fork would carry for a long time yet, from court to court and country to country, and it explains a great deal about why its progress was so slow. A tool may be adopted quickly, but a symbol must be argued over, generation after generation, and the fork had become, without ever intending to, a symbol. And yet to understand why its spread was so remarkably, so almost comically slow, we must turn away from the fork itself for a while, and look instead at the object that sat beside it on every table in Europe, the one implement that every diner already possessed, already trusted, and already carried with them as a matter of course. We must look at the knife, for the truth is that the fork could not simply arrive and be welcomed on its own merits, because there was already a tool doing much of the work the fork would one day do, and that tool was the personal knife that every man and very often every woman carried to the table upon their belt. In medieval and early modern Europe, dining was, as it were, a bring-your-own-knife affair. You did not expect your host to furnish you with a blade. You brought your own, a sharp, pointed personal knife, kept at your side through the whole of the day and drawn out at mealtimes to cut and to spear and to carry the food to your mouth upon its point. It was your everyday tool. And here is the thing we must understand. The thing that changes everything about how we picture that old shared table. It was the very same knife you would use to defend yourself, or to threaten another, or to fight. There was no separate class of dinner knives, gentle and blunt and made only for eating. The knife you ate with was a weapon, and the weapon you carried was what you ate with. The two purposes lived in a single blade. Think for a moment of what that meant for the table itself. A great hall at dinner was a room full of people, seated close together, warmed with wine, bound and divided by all the endless rivalries of rank and honour and old grievance, and every single one of them was armed, not with some hidden or ceremonial weapon, but with the plain working knife in their hand, the same knife they were at that very moment using to carve their meat. The shared table, so warm and close and complete, was also a table where every diner held a blade. And most of the time, of course, nothing came of it. Men ate and drank and quarrelled and laughed and went home, and the knives cut nothing but the roast. But the potential was always there, sitting on the cloth beside the bread, and in an age of hot tempers and easy violence and delicate points of honour, that potential could not be ignored forever. The dinner table was quietly and constantly a site of possible violence, a place where a sudden anger and a ready blade could meet in an instant, before anyone had time to think. And then came the events that made this danger impossible to overlook. In the year 1589, King Henry III of France was assassinated. He was killed by a monk, a young friar who came to him as if with a message, and who had concealed a dagger within his sleeve, and who drove it into the king before the guards could act. A blade, hidden and drawn close, ending the life of a king. And this was not the last of it. His successor, Henry IV, would himself survive attempt after attempt upon his life, more than one of them made with a knife or a dagger, before he too was at last struck down by a blade years later. The pointed knife in these years was not an abstraction of danger, but a proven instrument of it, a thing that had killed kings, that had come close to killing more, that a man might carry and conceal and draw in a heartbeat. And in the anxious courts of France, where the memory of these attacks lay heavy, the pointed dinner knife began to be seen not merely as a tool but as a hazard, a small, sharp, ever-present political danger, sitting upon every table in every hand at every meal. If a blade could kill a king, then perhaps it was not so wise to have a hall full of blades at every feast, their points glinting, their tips ready. The very ordinariness of the pointed knife, its presence at every table as a matter of unremarkable custom, now began to seem like a thing that ought to be looked at more carefully. It was Cardinal Richelieu, that most careful and calculating of statesmen, who is credited with taking the first quiet step. Sometime around the year 1637, in his own great household, he is said to have grown weary of the way his guests used their sharp-pointed knives, not only for the ever-present hazard of them, but for the coarser habit of using the sharp tip to pick at the teeth between courses, a practice he found distasteful at his fine table. And so he gave an order, small in itself but large in its consequences. He had the tips of the table knives in his household ground down, filed away from their sharp and dangerous points into smooth, rounded, oval ends, so that a guest could no longer easily settle a dispute with the blade, nor pick his teeth with it, nor spear his neighbour in a moment of wine and anger. It was a modest reform made in a single household, but it was a beginning. The blunt-tipped knife had entered the world, and among the French elite it began, slowly and gradually and without any sudden break, to catch on. The great houses saw the sense of it. A rounded knife could still cut. It simply could not stab. And in a nervous age that seemed a very reasonable thing for a knife to be. What began as one cardinal's household custom became in time the law of a whole kingdom. In the year 1669, King Louis XIV, the Sun King, who ordered so much of French life to his own grand design, formalised the change with a royal decree. Pointed knives were to be banned both in public and at the table throughout France. The sharp tip, that ancient and unremarkable feature of every eating blade, was to be done away with, ground down, rounded off, in the name of order and in the name of safety. It was, in its way, a deliberate disarming of the dinner table, a decision made from the very top that the meals of France should no longer be conducted with weapons in every hand. And though the decree was aimed at knives and said nothing at all about forks, it changed everything for the little instrument that had waited so long in the sweetmeat dishes. For here is the quiet consequence that no one perhaps quite intended. When you take the point off a knife, you take away its ability to spear. A pointed knife could stab a piece of meat and lift it whole to the mouth. It did the work of both cutting and carrying, but a blunt, round-tipped knife could only cut. It could no longer hold the food, no longer lift it, no longer carry it up from the plate, and so, at the very moment that the knife lost its point, a gap opened at the table. A task suddenly left undone, a job that needed doing, the simple job of holding the food steady and bringing it to the mouth. Something had to fill that gap, and there, waiting in the wings, its long apprenticeship among the sugared almonds finally coming to something, was the fork. Suddenly the fussy foreign affectation, the object of satirists and the symbol of Italian softness, revealed a plain and undeniable usefulness. With the point gone from the knife, the fork was no longer a mere ornament of delicacy, no longer a way of holding oneself apart from the food. It became, quite simply, a necessity. The tool that held the meat still while the blunt knife cut it, and the tool that lifted the cut piece up to the mouth in the knife's place. The fork's great advance then, when it finally came, was tied not to refinement alone, not only to the slow softening of manners that Elias had traced, but to something far more practical and even a little grim, to assassinations and royal decrees, to the deliberate blunting of 1,000 blades, to the disarming of the table by kings who had grown afraid of what a sharp point could do. The fork rose, in part because the knife was made safe, and once the knife was made safe, the fork was needed. It was, we might say, the knife's replacement, stepping quietly into the space the point had left behind. There is a fine irony in it, when you consider the whole long story, that the instrument once condemned as a needless and prideful luxury should have found its true opening not through any triumph of taste, but through fear of a monk's hidden dagger and the practical need to give a diner something to eat with once his blade could no longer be trusted. But all of this was unfolding chiefly in France, in the years and decades on either side of that great royal decree, and across the narrow channel of water to the north there was another country entirely, another people with their own robust ways and their own deep suspicion of anything that smelled of foreign softness. And in that country, England, the fork was about to make one of the most celebrated and one of the most mocked of all its entrances. For a little earlier, before Louis had ever ground a single knife, an Englishman had gone travelling upon the continent and had seen the Italians at their tables and had come home with a strange new habit and a book to tell the world about it. His name was Thomas Coriat, and he was, by every account, an eccentric, a courtier of sorts, a great walker, a man of enormous curiosity and enormous appetite for the world, who set off in the year 1608 to travel through Europe on foot and by whatever conveyance he could find, and who returned to write it all down. His book appeared in the year 1611, under a title that tells you a great deal about the humour of the man and the humour of his age. Coriat's Crudités, a great rambling record of everything he had seen upon his journey, printed and published for the entertainment and instruction of his countrymen. And among all the churches and the cities and the curiosities he described, Coriat set down something he had witnessed at the tables of Italy, something that had struck him as so remarkable and so worthy of imitation that he resolved to bring the custom home. The Italians, he reported with wonder, did not touch their meat with their fingers as good Englishmen did. Instead, when the meat was carved and set upon the shared dish, each diner used a little fork to take up his portion, holding the meat steady with the small pronged instrument while he cut it, so that his fingers never touched the common food at all. And the reason for this, Coriat explained to his readers, was that the Italians considered it a breach of good manners, a transgression against the very laws of courtesy, for a man to lay his fingers upon a dish of meat that others must also share. For not all men's hands, as they reasoned, were equally clean. And Coriat, having seen this and admired it, made his fateful declaration. he would do the same. He had taken up the custom himself, he announced, and would continue to use the little fork at his own table now that he was home in England, having found it so much the more cleanly and the more courteous way of eating. It was, one imagines, a small and harmless enough resolution, a travelled man bringing home a foreign habit he had come to prefer. But England, in the reign of the Jacobean age, was no more ready to welcome the fork than France had been, and Coryat's friends and contemporaries fell upon his new affectation with a delight that has echoed down the centuries. For here was an Englishman, a hearty islander, declaring that he would no longer eat like his fathers had eaten, that he would take up instead the fussy-pronged tool of the soft and papist Italians, and the wits of the age could not resist him. Among his mockers was no less a figure than the great playwright Ben Jonson, who contributed to the very preface of Coryat's own book a set of mocking verses, for it was the fashion of the time for an author's friends to adorn his work with such commendatory poems, and Coryat's friends adorned his with jokes at his expense, and they coined for him a nickname, a Latin word, a small cruel jewel of wordplay that captured the whole of their scorn. They called him Furcifer, and Furcifer was a fine and wicked pun, for on its face it meant simply fork-bearer, the man who carried the fork, which was mockery enough. But Furcifer was also an old Latin term of abuse, a word that meant a rascal, a scoundrel, a good-for-nothing rogue, so that in a single word they had branded him both the ridiculous champion of a foreign tool and a knave besides. The nickname stuck, as such nicknames do, and Coryat became a figure of caricature, the buffoon who ate with a fork, the court jester of the fashionable circles who treated his travels and his tastes as a great running joke. And in that mockery we can see, laid bare and complete, the whole cultural battle that the fork was still fighting even now, 600 years after it had first scandalised Venice. In England, as in France, the fork was not yet a neutral tool, not yet a simple convenience of the table. It was a marker of effeminacy, of a softness thought unbecoming to a strong man, a marker of foreign contamination, of Italian and papist ways creeping in where good plain English customs ought to reign, and a marker of social pretension, of a man thinking himself too fine and too delicate to eat as his neighbours ate. To take up the fork was to invite all of this upon oneself, and Thomas Coryat, in his cheerful and eccentric way, invited it upon himself entirely, and paid for it in ridicule. He remains, for all that, a precious record, for his book preserves, in an Englishman's own wandering words, exactly how the fork looked to a northern European seeing it fresh, and exactly why the Italians used it, and exactly how strange and laughable it still seemed to the men of the north. The little instrument had crossed another border, it had climbed out of the sweetmeats and reached at last toward the honest meat. And still, wherever it went, it was greeted first with laughter and with insult, a foreign guest at the table who had not yet learned to belong, and laughter, it turns out, was the gentler of the two weapons still ranged against the fork. For as the 17th century wore on, and as the little tool crept further into the lands of the north, it met something harder than a wit's mockery, and older than a courtier's disdain. It met a theology, a new and rigorous theology, sharpened to a fine edge in the meeting houses of England and the Low Countries and the raw new settlements across the ocean, and that theology looked upon the fork and did not laugh at all. It saw in the fork something sinful. The men who thought this way were the Calvinists and the Puritans, and they had inherited, without quite knowing it, the same old suspicion that a Benedictine monk had voiced 600 years before. For it had been Peter Damian, all those centuries earlier, who had first declared that God in his wisdom had provided man with natural forks, his fingers, and that it was therefore an insult to God to substitute artificial metal forks for them. That objection had never truly died. It had gone quiet during the long silence. It had been half forgotten in the merchant cities where the sweetmeat tool did its discreet work, but it had never been answered, never disproven, never laid to rest. And now, in the hands of the Puritan preachers, that same ancient argument was taken up again and given a new and more pointed force, made to serve a new war over the soul, and turned into something more severe than Damien himself had ever intended. For the Puritan mind was a mind that distrusted ornament in all its forms. It looked upon a plain wooden table and saw virtue, and it looked upon a table set with gleaming silver and saw the beginnings of sin. The Puritan sought simplicity in his church, stripping the altars bare and whitewashing the painted walls. He sought simplicity in his dress, in his speech, in the ordering of his days, and above all he sought simplicity in his soul, believing that the outward plainness of a man's life was the truest mirror of his inward state. To such a mind, the fork was a thing dangerous and suspect. It was silver, and silver was luxury. It was delicate, and delicacy was a snare. It was fine and fussy and fastidious, and every one of those qualities pointed away from the honest, hard, plain living that the Puritan believed God demanded of the faithful. Simplicity of eating, the reasoning ran, reflected simplicity of soul, and a man who required a little silver pitchfork to lift his food to his mouth was a man who had let vanity creep into the most ordinary corner of his life, a man who thought too well of himself, a man too soft for the labours of grace. And there was more to the Puritan objection than plainness alone, for the fork carried upon it indelibly the stain of its origins. It had come out of Italy. It had been the tool of the Italian courts, the courts of princes and cardinals and the great banking families, and above all it was associated in the northern imagination with the court of Rome itself, and with the whole apparatus of the Catholic faith that the Puritans had crossed an ocean to escape. To the Calvinist, the fork was not merely luxury and not merely vanity, it was popish. It reeked of the decadence of the papacy, of the perfumed idleness of Catholic princes, of everything that the Reformation had risen up against. To take a fork in hand was, in some small but not insignificant way, to reach back toward Rome, to flirt with the softness and the corruption that the Reformers believed had rotted the old church from within, and so the fork, which had already been condemned as a sin against God's design, and mocked as an effeminate affectation, and scorned as a foreign contamination, now acquired yet another layer of meaning in the northern mind. It became a proxy in a religious war, a small silver token of which side a man stood upon, whether he leaned toward the austere purity of the Reformed faith, or toward the gilded excess of the old one. We can see this quarrel written plainly in the household records of the New World, in the inventories of the settlers who had carried their theology across the Atlantic to the rocky shores of New England. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, among the Puritan families who had come to build a city upon a hill and to live according to the strictest reading of Scripture, the fork is conspicuously and tellingly absent. Go through the household inventories of those settlements, the careful lists that were made of a man's goods, his pewter and his linen, his pots and his spoons and his knives, and you will search a long time before you find a fork among them. Well into the 1700s, deep into the 18th century, the fork simply does not appear in most New England households. The families ate as their grandfathers had eaten, with the traditional and trusted combination of the knife, the spoon, and the fingers, and they saw no reason to change, and indeed they saw every reason not to. Now this absence, it must be said, was not merely a matter of the fork being hard to come by in a distant colony. It was not that the ships did not bring forks, or that the silversmiths could not make them. The fork was known. Even in Massachusetts Bay there were men who possessed one, for Governor John Winthrop himself, the leader of the colony, is recorded as having owned a fork as early as 1633, kept in a case with a knife, a fine imported thing brought over from England. So the fork was not unknown in New England, not entirely unavailable, not beyond the reach of a man of means. And yet even the governor's example did not spread. The broader population did not follow. The fork remained a rarity, a curiosity possessed by a very few and used by fewer still, and the great mass of the colonists went on eating without it, year after year, generation after generation. The delay was not a want of forks, it was a moral stance. It was a decision, half conscious and half inherited, that the fork was not the sort of thing a plain and godly household ought to want. And the flavour of that decision comes down to us in the words that were spoken against the fork in those years, blunt and homely words that carried the whole force of Puritan common sense. "We have no forks," went one such saying, "to make hay with our mouths," and in that single rough phrase you can hear the entire New England attitude toward the little tool. It was a farmer's phrase, an image drawn from the hayfield, from the honest labour of the land, and it captured perfectly the sense that the fork was a foolish and pretentious thing, a delicate implement wholly out of place in a life built on work and prayer and plainness. To eat with a fork was, in this view, to play the fine gentleman at your own table, to fuss and to primp over your food like some soft courtier, when a strong man ought simply to take his meat in his fingers and be grateful to God for it. The fork was a vanity, and the Puritans of New England had crossed the sea precisely to leave vanity behind. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of this, on how far and how long the old objection had travelled. Here, in the wilderness of North America, in a settlement founded more than 600 years after a Venetian bride had first scandalized her wedding guests, the fork was still being refused for reasons that Peter Damien would have recognized in an instant. Still, it was thought an insult to the natural forks that God had given. Still, it was thought a mark of pride and softness and excessive delicacy. The world had changed almost beyond recognition in those 6 centuries. Empires had risen and fallen, the church had split in two, whole new continents had opened to European eyes, and yet the fork was fighting on the shores of the New World the very same battle it had lost in Venice so long ago. The little instrument had crossed an ocean and found the old suspicion waiting for it on the far shore. But the ocean had 2 shores in the New World, and they did not think alike. For while the Puritan North refused the fork on principle, another sort of colony lay to the south, and there the story ran quite differently. In Anglican Virginia, in the tobacco lands along the great rivers, the settlers had brought a different faith and a different temper. They were, many of them, gentlemen and would-be gentlemen, men who looked back to the manners of the English court rather than to the meeting house, men for whom refinement was not a snare but an aspiration. The Church of England, which they carried with them, had never scoured the fork from its conscience the way the Puritans had. It kept its bishops and its ornament and its ceremony, and it did not see a silver tool at the table as a step back toward Rome. And so in Virginia the fork gained a foothold that it never gained in Massachusetts. It appeared earlier, it spread more readily. It was received not as a popish vanity, but as one more mark of the Polish and the gentility to which a Virginia planter aspired. The very same object, the same little pronged tool of Italian silver, was in one colony a badge of civilization and in the other a token of sin. The line between them was not one of wealth or of supply but of belief. The fork had become, on the American continent, a reliable measure of a man's religion, and you could very nearly tell from whether a household owned one which side of the great divide of the age its people stood upon. And while the theologians and the colonists were quarrelling over whether the fork ought to be used at all, another matter had been quietly settling itself in the workshops of Europe, the matter of whether the fork could even be used well. For here we must be honest about the tool itself, about the thing over which so much ink and passion had been spilled. The fork of the early centuries, the fork that Maria Argyropolina had lifted to her lips and that Thomas Coyat had carried home from Italy, was a two-tined thing, and the two-tined fork was, in plain truth, an awkward and unsatisfactory instrument to eat with. It had begun its life not as an eating tool at all, but as a tool for carving and serving, a small version of the great forks used to steady a joint of meat while it was cut or to lift a portion from a shared dish, and its shape betrayed that origin. Its 2 tines were straight and widely spaced, made for spearing and holding, not for gathering and lifting to the mouth. Food slipped from it, peas rolled off it, small morsels fell between the prongs or balanced precariously and tumbled away before they reached the lips. The gesture it required was unnatural and precarious, a careful and anxious business of impaling and balancing that a man raised to eat with his confident 3 fingers found clumsy and absurd. And this awkwardness was, for the fork's critics, the finest ammunition they could have asked for. It was easy to mock a tool that did not work. It was easy to point at the fumbling first user, dropping his food and spearing at his plate, and to declare that here was proof positive of the fork's foolishness, that a man who abandoned his good and reliable fingers for this fiddly failure of an implement was a fool who had earned his troubles. The 2-tined fork gave its enemies every reason to sneer, and they sneered accordingly. It was, they said, an unnecessary affectation, effeminate and impractical, a devil's tool for those too proud to touch the good food that the Lord had provided. For once again the old argument returned, that to refuse to touch one's food with one's hands was to suggest that God's bounty was somehow unworthy of human contact, too fine or too clean to be handled by the very hands that God himself had made. The impracticality of the tool and the impiety of the tool were braided together in the minds of its critics, each seeming to prove the other, so that the fork's very awkwardness was taken as evidence of its wrongness. But quietly, without fanfare, the tool was changing. In the silversmithing workshops of Germany and of France, across the late 17th century and into the early years of the 18th, the fork underwent a slow and patient transformation at the hands of craftsmen who cared nothing for theology and everything for function. They added tines. Where the old fork had borne 2 straight prongs, the new forks began to bear 3 and then 4, and with the addition of those extra tines the whole character of the instrument was changed. And they did something else, something subtler and more clever still. They curved the tines, gave them a gentle bend so that the fork was no longer merely a spear but had become in effect a shallow scoop. And this made all the difference in the world. The 4-tined, curved fork could do what the 2-tined fork never could. It could gather the small and unruly foods, the peas, the grains, the little scattered morsels that had defeated its ancestor. It could hold them and lift them without their slipping through or rolling off. It could manage a bite of meat reliably, steadying it and raising it to the mouth without dropping it along the way. The fork, after long centuries of being an awkward novelty, had at last become a genuinely useful tool. The change came gradually, as such changes do, spread across decades and across many workshops and many hands, with no single moment that we can point to and say that here the modern fork was born. And even as it improved, the fork's advance was slowed by the caution of the great, and by none more famously than the man who sat at the very summit of European taste. For at Versailles, in the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, whose palace had become the epicenter of culinary refinement for all of Europe, whose every gesture was studied and imitated by the courts of a dozen lesser kingdoms. At Versailles, the king would not use a fork. Louis, who had reigned since 1643, who ruled longer and more grandly than any monarch of his age, preferred through much of his life to eat with his fingers, in the old manner, with the practiced dexterity of a man who had never seen any need to change. It is a striking thing to consider that the same king who had, in 1669, ordered the rounding of the pointed knife tips at his table to curb the violence of the dinner hour, the very king whose blunted knives had opened the gap that the fork was so perfectly suited to fill, would not himself take up the fork that his own decree had made so useful. The 2-tined fork he had known was still the awkward thing of old, and the Sun King, for all his refinement, saw no reason to fumble with it when his fingers served him so well. And so the great question hung over the improved tool. For once the fork actually worked, once it could gather peas and lift meat and do reliably all the things its ancestor had failed to do, the ground shifted beneath its old objectors. As long as the fork was awkward, its critics could dismiss it as a foolish and useless affectation, and there was truth enough in the charge to make it stick. But a tool that works is a harder thing to argue against. When the fork became genuinely convenient, genuinely cleaner and easier and more graceful than the alternative, the old objections had to stand on their own, stripped of the easy help that the fork's clumsiness had lent them. Could the moral objectors still resist it now? Could a man still call it vanity and popish decadence and softness, now that it plainly did its work better than fingers could? The question was forced back into the open, and the answer, when it came, would not come from the theologians at all. It would come from the court. For the great dam broke at Versailles, and it broke almost the moment the old king died. Louis XIV passed away on the first day of September, in the year 1715, after a reign so long that scarcely anyone at court could remember a time before him, and with his passing the whole rigid apparatus of his court began to loosen. His successor was a great-grandson still a child, and so the government of France fell for a time to a regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, who ruled in the young king's name through the years that came to be called the Regency. And the Regency was a season of unbuttoning, a great exhalation after the long-held breath of the Sun King's reign. The rigid, absolute ceremonial control that Louis had imposed upon every corner of court life gave way to something softer and more private, more refined, more sophisticated in its pleasures. Manners liberalised. The stiff formality of the old court melted into a new and elegant ease, and it was in precisely this loosening, this turning toward private refinement and quiet luxury, that the fork made its decisive entrance into the aristocratic dining of France. Not as a scandal, not as an affectation, but as a standard and expected implement of the civilized table. We can trace the change in the very records of Versailles itself, in the menus and the table diagrams that were preserved in the palace archives, documents that show us how the great meals were laid and served. And across these records, in the years after the old king's death, the fork settles into its place. It ceases to be remarkable. It becomes, simply, part of how a table is set, one of the ordinary tools that a well-appointed diner expects to find beside his plate. The 4-tined curved fork, the practical fork, the fork that worked, took up its position in the left hand, steadying the food, while the blunted knife did its cutting, and in doing so it completed the pairing that Lewis's ban on pointed knives had first made necessary. The old two-knife style of dining, in which a man had used one blade to cut and another to spear, had been rendered obsolete the moment the knife tips were rounded, and into that vacancy the fork slid at last, natural and inevitable, the missing partner that the table had been waiting for. By the middle of the 18th century, the four-tined fork had become the standard, and it had begun to take over tasks that had long belonged to the spoon, so thoroughly had it woven itself into the fabric of the meal. And what happened at Versailles did not stay at Versailles, for French courtly fashion was, in that age, the defining force in the taste of all Europe. What the French court did, the courts of Europe copied. What pleased in Paris pleased soon after in Vienna and in London, and in the palaces of 100 German princelings, all of them looking to France as the very fountainhead of manners and refinement. And so the fork, having become the mark of the civilized Frenchman, was exported outward with astonishing speed as the mark of the civilized person everywhere. Within a single generation, the whole moral calculus that had governed the fork for 600 years turned itself completely inside out. The thing that had once branded a man as vain, as effeminate, as foreign, as popish, as soft, now became the very opposite. To use a fork was now the mark of the polished and the well-bred, and to refuse it, to reach for one's food with one's fingers as every generation of ancestors had done, was suddenly to announce oneself as a provincial boor, a coarse and backward creature who did not know how a gentleman behaved. The very gesture that had once been the confident art of the refined table, the graceful management of the three fingers, was now the sign of the rustic and the uncouth. It was coarse and ungraceful, went the new wisdom of the age, to throw one's food into one's mouth as one would toss hay into a barn with a pitchfork, and the old New England taunt, that a man needed no forks to make hay with his mouth, had been turned precisely on its head, so that now it was the man without a fork who was the hay-tosser, the clumsy labourer at his own table. It is one of the most complete reversals in the whole long history of manners, and it happened within the span of a lifetime. The fork had been condemned by a saint, cursed by association with a princess's death, hidden in the sweetmeats for 300 years, mocked in France and ridiculed in England, refused on principle in Puritan New England, and now, quite suddenly, it stood triumphant at the finest tables in Europe, and it was the men who clung to the old ways who found themselves ashamed. The moral objection had not been defeated in argument. No preacher had risen to declare Peter Damian wrong. No treatise had answered the charge of vanity and popish decadence point by point. The objection had simply been overwhelmed, swept aside by the irresistible tide of fashion, flowing outward from a French court that had grown weary of the old king's rigour and hungry for elegant new refinements. The fork had won not the argument, but the age, and having conquered the aristocracy of Europe, it now turned its face westward once more, back across the ocean, toward the one great holdout that had refused it longest, and would refuse it still a while yet. That holdout was America, and it is worth pausing here, in the low warm light of this long telling, to appreciate just how stubbornly the young country dug in its heels. For America had inherited every reason to distrust the fork, and had softened none of them. It had the memory of the Puritan objection, the deep suspicion of luxury and vanity that had crossed the Atlantic in the same ships as the settlers. It had the plain living of the frontier, where a man carried a single knife and needed nothing finer. And after the Revolution, it had something new, something the old world did not have, a proud and prickly sense of republican virtue, a conviction that the elaborate refinements of European courts were precisely the soft and corrupting things that a free and simple people ought to reject. To the American mind of the late 18th century, the fork was not merely foreign, it was aristocratic. It smelled of powdered wigs and gilded palaces and everything that the new republic had crossed an ocean and fought a war to leave behind. And so America, which had every practical ability to adopt the fork, refused it longer than any other Western society that knew it existed, refused it on principle, refused it out of a plain democratic pride in doing without. For a long stretch of the country's early life, the fork remained a curiosity in most American homes, a thing one might have heard of but rarely seen, present in a few wealthy households along the coast and all but unknown in the interior. The ordinary American ate as his grandfather had eaten, with a knife and a spoon and his own good fingers, and thought nothing lacking in the arrangement. The knife did the cutting, and in the old style the spearing and lifting too, for the American knife had not been blunted by any Sun King's decree, and kept its useful point. Bread in the hand did the rest. It was an honest way to eat, and to most of the people doing it, an entirely sufficient one. Into this settled world of plain American dining walked one of the most curious and cultivated men the young nation ever produced, and it is around him that the last great turning of our story gathers. Thomas Jefferson had gone to France in the year 1784 as a diplomat, and he had stayed there through the closing years of the decade until 1789, in the very seat of the culture that had made the fork the mark of the civilized man. Jefferson was a man of enormous and restless curiosity, a collector of ideas and instruments and improvements of every kind, and France worked upon him as it worked upon few of his countrymen. He fell in love with its food, with its wines, with the whole graceful apparatus of its dining, and he did not merely admire these things from a distance, he took them into himself. In the year 1784 in Paris, he purchased 24 silver forks and spoons, and in time he carried them home across the ocean to the mountain in Virginia, where he had built his great house, to Monticello, that curious and beautiful dwelling that was itself a kind of argument in stone for the marriage of New World independence and Old World refinement. And so it came to pass that at Monticello, and later at the dinners Jefferson gave when he had risen to the presidency, guests found themselves confronted with forks. To us this seems the smallest of things, hardly worth a second glance. To Jefferson's American contemporaries it was worth a great deal of remark. He was thought, in this as in a good many of his tastes, something of an eccentric, a man who had come back from France with his head full of foreign notions and his table set with foreign implements, a man whose enthusiasms ran ahead of what plain Republican sense could easily follow. There were those who admired it, and those who found it faintly ridiculous, this insistence on the fussy little Parisian ways at the table of the leader of a free people. The records that survive from his presidency, from the dinners he gave in the still young executive mansion in the first years of the new century, around the year 1801, carry that faint note of surprise. Guests remarked upon the forks that were provided. They noticed them. They spoke of them as something out of the ordinary, worth a comment, worth a raised eyebrow, the mark of a host whose refinements went a step beyond what the company expected. The very fact that a fork at dinner was a thing to be commented upon tells us how far the fork still stood, in the American mind of 1801, from being a matter of course. Yet here we must tread with the same care that the honest historian always urges upon us, for this is precisely the sort of story that loves to grow in the telling. As the historian Anna Burks has observed of the tales that gather around Jefferson, things like these require you to tread carefully. Folks love to exaggerate facts, and the temptation to make Jefferson the single man who taught America to use a fork is a temptation to be gently resisted. He did not invent the American fork. He did not conjure it out of nothing. The fork had drifted into the wealthiest coastal households before him, and it would have made its way inward with or without him in time. What Jefferson did was something subtler and, in its way, more important. He lent the fork the weight of his own enormous prestige. He made it the mark not of a foreign fop, but of an American statesman of the highest cultivation, a founder of the Republic, a president. He took a thing that carried the taint of aristocratic softness and set it down upon the most respectable American table in the land, and in doing so he began, quietly, to strip away its foreignness. He was to the American fork what Catherine de' Medici had been to the French fork almost 3 centuries before, not the origin but the validation, the figure whose standing gave the thing permission to belong. And there is a small and lovely legacy of this American reluctance that survives to this very day, carried down through the generations in the unthinking movements of millions of hands. Because forks came late to America and came scarce, the early settler had learned to do everything with his knife and his spoon, to cut with the one and to lift and carry with either, the right hand doing the whole work of the meal. When the fork finally arrived and became common, it slid into the left hand to hold and steady the food for cutting, as it did everywhere. But the old habit of lifting the food to the mouth with the right hand was too deeply worn into the American body to be undone, and so the American diner, having cut his food with the knife in the right hand and the fork in the left, sets down the knife, passes the fork across to the right hand, and only then carries the morsel to his mouth, cut, switch, and eat. It is called the zigzag style, and it puzzles Europeans who keep the fork in the left hand throughout and think the American way a great and needless fuss of shuffling implements back and forth. But it is not fussiness. It is memory. It is the ghost of a time when there was no fork to speak of, when the right hand and its knife did all the labour of the table, and the muscle memory of that vanished world lives on in the hand of every American who switches his fork without ever knowing why. The old New England household that had no forks to make hay with its mouth left this small inheritance behind, this little dance of the utensils, a fossil of scarcity preserved in the manners of abundance. So the last cultural holdout began, slowly, to fold. But a cultural holdout can only be persuaded so far by the example of a president. What finally overwhelmed the American resistance, and indeed, what finally overwhelmed the last lingering resistance everywhere, was not a change of heart at all. It was a change in the price of things. For all through this long story the fork had carried, alongside its sin and its foreignness and its softness, one plain and stubborn fact that no preacher and no fashion could argue away. It was expensive. The fine fork was a thing of silver, and silver was the metal of the rich. A set of silver forks was a small fortune, an heirloom, a thing that appeared in wills and was passed with care from one generation to the next. However the fashions ran, the ordinary man could no more furnish his table with silver forks than he could pave his floor with coins. The fork remained, for most of the human beings who ever lived within reach of it, a luxury simply out of reach, and this alone kept it from the common table long after the moral objection had crumbled. The fork could not become universal so long as it had to be made of precious metal. And then, quite quietly, in a workshop in the English Midlands, that final barrier fell away. The place was Birmingham, a great grimed and clattering city of manufactures, of workshops and forges, and the endless ingenuity of men who made things for a living, and the men were two cousins, George Richards Elkington and Henry Elkington. In the year 1840 they patented a process that would remake the material life of the ordinary household, a process called electroplating. The principle was simple to state and marvellous in its consequences. By passing an electric current through a bath in the proper way, one could cause a thin skin of silver to settle evenly over an object made of some cheaper base metal, often a hard whitish alloy called nickel-silver that carried no silver in it at all but only looked the part. The object beneath was common metal, worth almost nothing. The coating of true silver upon it was so thin as to cost a mere fraction of a solid piece, and yet, to the eye and to the hand at the table, the electroplated fork gleamed like the real thing, felt like the real thing, served every purpose the real thing had ever served. It was, for all that mattered at dinner, a silver fork, and it could be made for a small share of the old price. The effect of this was quiet at first and then enormous, the way such things always are. For 600 years the fork had been held back from the ordinary table by its cost as surely as by its sin, and now, in the space of a couple of decades, the cost simply melted away. Elkington and Company and the makers who followed them poured out electroplated cutlery by the crate and the case and the fork, which had climbed so slowly and so painfully from the golden instrument of a Byzantine princess to the silver ornament of the European aristocrat, came tumbling down at last into the reach of the shopkeeper, the clerk, the tradesman, the farmer's wife, the whole vast rising body of the middle class that the industrial age was calling into being. By the 1860s, the affordable fork had flooded the markets of Britain, of the United States, of the whole of Europe. The thing that Peter Damian had condemned as the vanity of a princess was on its way to becoming the birthright of every family that could keep a tidy house. The fork had been democratized, and no sermon had done it and no king had done it. It had been done by a bath of chemicals and a current of electricity in a Birmingham workshop, by the plain machinery of the industrial age, which cared nothing for theology and nothing for republican virtue, and only for the making of useful things cheaply and in great number. And here the story performs one last small turn that is, in its way, the most human and the most amusing of them all. For as long as the fork had been rare and costly, its mere possession had said something. To own a set of forks was to declare that you were a person of means and refinement, and that was enough. But now that everyone could own a fork, the fork by itself said nothing at all. The shopkeeper had one, the clerk had one, presently the labouring family had one. As the curator Dara Goldstein has put it, a fork was no longer cool, it was common, and that was a problem for anyone who had used the fork to mark himself as fine. When ownership becomes universal, ownership can no longer be a mark of distinction, and the fashionable world, which has always needed some way to sort itself from the crowd, was obliged to find a new frontier. It found it not in having the fork, but in knowing how to use it. If everyone possessed a fork, then the divide would run between those who used it correctly and those who did not, between those who had been taught the intricate proper motions and those who fumbled and guessed. The rules for the fork's use, which had scarcely needed stating when only a few could own one, now multiplied with astonishing speed, and a whole literature sprang up to teach them. This was the golden age of the etiquette manual, and it is no accident that it arrived exactly when it did, hand in hand with a cheap electroplated fork. The most famous of these guides, at least in the English-speaking world, was Isabella Beeton's great compendium, the Book of Household Management, published in 1861, a vast and confident volume that told the rising middle-class wife how to run every corner of her home, how to manage servants, how to plan a dinner, how to lay a table, and how, of course, to handle the growing regiment of implements that now crowded the well-set place. It was an immense success, selling 60,000 copies in its first year alone, which tells us how hungry that new class of household was for exactly this kind of instruction, how badly it wanted to be told the right way to do the things it had lately gained the means to do. Mrs. Beeton's book, and the hundreds that followed it, were, in truth, ladders. They were the means by which a family that had risen in the world could learn to behave as though it had always been there, and the fork, with its proper positions and its proper motions, was one of the chief rungs of that ladder. Later still, when the mail-order houses arose, the fork reached even the most isolated corners of the land. The great American firm of Sears, Roebuck and Company, founded in 1886, sent its thick catalogues into the farmhouses of the plains and the cabins of the mountains, and there among its pages, listed plainly among the wares that any rural family might order sent by rail, was cutlery, forks by the set, cheap and gleaming, delivered to the very doorstep of homes that a lifetime earlier would have had no forks to make hay with their mouths. The circle had closed. The instrument of the princess had become the merchandise of the mail-order catalogue. And the fashionable world, watching the fork sink into universal ownership, did the thing the fashionable world always does, which is to run ahead into ever finer and finer distinctions. If the plain fork was now common, then the refined table would distinguish itself by the sheer number and specialization of its forks, a fork for this and a fork for that, a proliferation of little instruments each dedicated to a single narrow task. There arose the sardine fork and the olive fork and the macaroni fork, the oyster fork and the pastry fork and the fork for lifting a single sliver of lemon, a whole bristling armoury of specialized tines, until the properly set table of the wealthy Victorian became a bewildering parade of silver, an arrangement so elaborate that navigating it correctly was itself a skill that only the initiated possessed. And this, of course, was precisely the point. The multiplication of forks was the aristocracy's answer to the democratization of the fork. When the fork itself could no longer separate the fine from the common, the correct and knowing use of a dozen different forks could. The sin had become the standard, and now the standard, having become universal, had bred 1,000 small new rules by which the game of status could go on being played. Peter Damien had feared the fork as an emblem of pride, and here at the end, in the glittering over-furnished dining rooms of the 19th century, pride had found in the fork a richer soil than the old monk could ever have imagined, not in the having of it, but in the knowing, in the endless refinement of the ways it might be used to tell one kind of person from another. So the war was over, or so it seemed. The fork had conquered every table in the Western world, from the palace to the farmhouse, and the objections that had held it back for 900 years lay forgotten. So completely forgotten that the ordinary person reaching for a fork at supper had no idea there had ever been objections at all, no idea that a saint had cursed it, or a princess had died for it, or a whole continent had refused it out of piety and pride. The fork had simply become part of the furniture of life, one of those things that seem to have always existed and to require no thought whatsoever, and that very forgetting is perhaps the truest measure of how total its victory had been. But it is worth asking here at the close, in this quiet hour, whether the old monk who condemned it at the very beginning was, in some strange and secular sense, right after all. Not right about the sin, of course, not right about the divine punishment or the vanity against God, but right about something underneath all that, something he glimpsed in his fury and named badly but did not entirely misunderstand. For consider what the fork actually did across those 900 years, beneath all the theology and all the class warfare. It changed the relationship between the human body and its food. Before the fork, to eat was to touch, to take one's nourishment directly with one's own hand, to share a dish and a bowl, and the warmth of common contact with everyone else at the table. The hand in the shared dish was a kind of trust, a bond, a physical acknowledgement that the eaters were bound together in the act of eating. The fork severed that touch. It placed a small, cool instrument of metal between the body and its food, and it did so for each diner individually, so that each person came to the meal armed with his own separate tool, taking his own separate portion to his own separate mouth, without ever touching the food that others would touch. This is the thing the sociologist recognized when he spoke of the invisible wall the fork raised between the eaters, and it is a thing we can see all around us still, so ordinary that we never notice it. The Western table is a table of individual place settings, individual portions, individual instruments, each diner sealed within his own small territory of plate and fork and knife and glass. And the Western diner, set down at a table anywhere else in the world where people still eat with their hands from a common dish, feels a flicker of discomfort he cannot quite name, a strange reluctance to plunge his fingers into the shared food, a sense that this is somehow improper, somehow unclean, though the truth is that his own way is merely one way among many, and the hand-eaters of the world are far more numerous than he is. That discomfort is the fork's deepest legacy, worn so far down into the Western body that it feels like nature and is in fact history, the long, slow work of a small metal instrument reshaping the very instinct of how a human being takes his food. The anthropologist Mary Douglas, in her great study of the ideas of purity and danger, taught us that every society draws its lines of clean and unclean, of order and disorder, and that what we call dirt is very often simply matter out of place, a thing that has crossed a boundary it was meant to respect. Food on the fingers, in the world the fork made, became a kind of dirt, matter out of place, a violation of the boundary between the body and its nourishment that the instrument had been raised to maintain. The fork, in this light, was never merely a tool. It was a way of ordering the world, of separating the self from what it consumed, of drawing a clean private line around each eater and defending it against the messy communal touch of older ways. And when Peter Damian looked at the golden instrument in the hand of the Byzantine princess and recoiled, when he called it pride and vanity and an affront to the God who gave us fingers, he was reacting in his own theological language to exactly this. He sensed that the fork was drawing a new boundary, setting the eater apart, individualizing and refining and distancing, and he did not like it, and he could not have said precisely why, and so he reached for the words he had, the words of sin. He was wrong in his theology and wrong in his cruelty toward a young woman who died too soon, but he was not entirely wrong that something was at stake at that table, that the little fork carried a genuine argument about the body and its boundaries, about togetherness and separation, about what it means to be a creature that must eat and yet wishes to be more than a creature. That argument was never really settled. It was only overwhelmed and then forgotten. The fork did not win because it was proved right and the fingers proved wrong. It won because of blunted knives and courtly fashion, and cheap electricity, because of accidents of history that had nothing to do with the deep question it raised. And so we live now on the far side of a great civilizational argument about the body and the shared meal, an argument that ran for 9 centuries and touched saints and princesses and presidents and Puritans, and we live on its far side without even knowing it was fought. Every time we set the table, every time we lay the fork beside the plate in its appointed place, we are enacting the outcome of a war we have forgotten we ever had, keeping faith with a victory whose meaning we never pause to understand. The fork sits quiet in the drawer, humble and ordinary and utterly triumphant, and it remembers nothing, and neither do we. So the next time you take up a fork at the close of a long day, in the soft light of your own kitchen, you might hold it a moment and think of the whole long road it travelled to reach your hand. Think of the golden facilla glinting in a Venetian hall 1,000 years ago. Think of the 300 silent years and the sweetmeats, and the merchant of Prato's careful ledgers. Think of Catherine carrying her forks across the sea to France, and the mocked traveller in England, and the plain New England household that scorned it, and the Birmingham cousins with their bath of silver, and the Sears catalogue arriving at a farmhouse on the wind-scoured plains. It is all there, all of it, folded invisibly into the small ordinary weight of the thing in your fingers, the whole long human argument about touch and separation, about the body and the boundary, about what we are to one another when we sit down together to eat. And now the telling is done, and there is nothing left to carry you anywhere but gently down into rest. The fork lies quiet in the drawer, its long war ended and forgotten, and the tables of the world are set, and the great slow river of manners flows on as it always has, changing everything and asking nothing, carrying each small object and each small custom forward into the ordinary life of tomorrow. Take a slow breath now. Feel the soft weight of the covers over you, the quiet of the darkened room, the day set down at last like a knife laid to rest beside a plate. There is nothing more to decide tonight, nothing more to hold, no argument left to settle. Let the small, strange history of one small, strange instrument drift away from you now like a boat loosed gently from its mooring. Sleep well, and let the long, calm current of the past carry you softly into peaceful dreams.